This video is about how to use the paint tools and custom palettes to color and annotate a graph paper. I'm going to assume that you are already comfortable creating a custom graph paper, because it is important to get your grid layout just exactly how you want it before opening it in Paint, because Paint converts a paper into an image. So, if you later discover you need the paper to be slightly different, you'll have to quit Paint, open and edit the graph paper, and then bring that new revised paper into Paint and begin again. Let's get started with this brick paper I found in Quick Picks. At the top is the paintbrush that opens Paint. To start, I must pick the image quality I want to work with. There are three options. The smaller 612 by 792 pixel image will be the fastest of the three to load, the most responsive while painting, and have the smallest file size. As you go up in quality, the image becomes more crisp, but the file size larger. I'll pick one. Paint opens with an image of the full graph paper. The Paint tool box is at the bottom on the left. The brush tool is open, so the palettes are shown to the right. To change the color to another in the standard palette, tap a circle to change the hue, then tap a color square below it to choose a shade. If knowing the RGB value of a color is helpful, look to the far right for the small text above the palette that reports the RGB number of the selected shade. To paint, I just tap a square on the grid. I can zoom in to make painting easier, and a long press paints multiple squares in a pattern. Later, we'll cover how to configure a long press. Colors can be replaced by using the no color choice with the red slash, or overpainting with a different color. Paint erase options are at the top. Undo steps back one paint action at a time. The eraser clears the screen of all painting. A tool related to paint is texture. Texture sets whether the painting is done with a solid or a pattern in the selected color. Patterns can be used to mimic materials or as the keys for a legend to a grid. Switch the color, and you'll continue coloring in the same pattern. Next is the timeline. It's handy because once you settle into the textures and colors for a project, it is a shortcut to find those recently used. The history section shows those from earlier sessions. Let's move to the bottom row of the toolbox. Here are the four annotation tools. Text adds text with settings for size, color, and background. Tap a spot where you'd like to place text. Tap in the entry box to bring up the keyboard. I'll just type a note for an example. A tap anywhere closes the text box. To edit text, just tap it to reopen the edit tools. Text has a transparent background by default, but it can be changed to a white background. To move text, confirm it is open, outlined by a dotted line, and then drag it to where you want it. There are three line tools: freehand, straight, and 45 degree. Each has controls for line weight and color. They are edited similar to text. Just tap to highlight, and then open the edit tools, change the line weight, color, or drag to reposition. The last tool in the top row controls layer visibility. The 5 layers are listed in order. Image is the bottom layer, and text is the top layer. Image is a special layer that only exists when the grid is brought in with a background image. If any of the annotation layers have been hidden, say for instance lines, adding a new annotation will unhide that layer when the edit tool is opened. Let's look at 3 tools that can make painting and annotating a little easier. Open more to find them: long press paint settings, snap grid settings, and background color. First, long press paint settings. Just like the name suggests, this sets the paint pattern for a long press. This quick painting feature is really helpful for makers whose project plans are in predictable patterns, like quilting, beading, knitting, cross stitch, decorative knots, wood turning, really many sorts of projects. Let's try it out. At the top left of the pop-up is a map showing how a long press will follow the major grid. The red square marks the point of the long press, and the green squares show the paint pattern. The pattern is controlled by the settings for pattern, repeat, and direction. As an example, I'll change the setting in pattern from everywhere to checkerboard. A look at the map shows the new pattern. Tapping outside the pop-up closes it. Before starting, I'll clear the grid, erase the coloring, and delete the line and text. Now I'm ready to try out the long press. Coloring in a pattern is much easier with long press. Let's go back to more and look at the next feature, Snap Grid Settings. Because the paper is brought into Paint as an image, it's really more like a picture of the grid than an actual grid. Snap Grid Settings adds guidelines to help with alignment when placing annotations. Tap the switch to enable, and tap a color to see the guidelines. The controls adjust the default placement of the guidelines from the major grid to where they will be most helpful. And also, if I don't want to see these guidelines, I can tap the color to hide them. And as long as Snap to Grid switch is set on, the guidelines are active and working. As an example, let's use 45-degree lines to see how Snap Grid settings make precise placement of annotations easier. I'm finding it really easy to draw diagonal lines that perfectly fit to the grid. Now watch what happens when I tap a line and start to drag it. Guides appear at the corners of the object outline in relation to the guide line. The red guides show me when it is near the grid line. The green light appears when an endpoint is at the grid line. Repositioning text, straight and free form lines is similar. The third feature in More is background color. These settings change the background color from white to a solid color or transparent. A transparent background can be important for importing painted papers into another program. I'll use the gray palette to set the background back to white. Finally, the last feature we'll talk about is a unique feature that is really appreciated by creatives who like using graph paper. Custom palettes let you expand beyond the built-in color palettes and add the colors you want on as many different palettes as you want to create. I'll open Colors, tap plus on the Hue row to create a new custom palette. Colors are added in two ways. One way is as a shade from the color picker by tapping the plus or dragging a color picker tile up to the palette. The shades on the color picker come from the hue shown on the color wheel. Change the color wheel by dragging the handles on the outer ring and the center square. However, another way to set a color is to tap the eye beside the wheel and enter a specific RGB or HSB color. Drag tiles to arrange colors on the palette. Here's a tip. To get rid of a color in the palette, replace the tile you no longer want by dragging a white tile in the palette to replace it. Or you can set the color wheel to white to create a white tile. The other way to add colors to the palette is to select colors off an image from your camera roll or your live camera screen. To the right of the palette are the buttons to take you to either the camera or to an inspirational image on your camera roll. As an example, I'll use my camera to capture an image of a vintage fabric so I can select some authentic vintage colors. I can move the picker in camera mode and tap plus to add a color. I'm not limited to working with a live camera shot. I can tap the pause button and grab a screenshot. Here's a tip. Using the tool in the lower left, you can adjust the number of pixels averaged to make a color. Now, with a fixed image, it's also easier to use the color dot to help me perfect my color selections. By placing a color dot next to the shade of a color I want to capture, I can then move the picker in that color area, and I'll know that I've found a match when the dot blends in. And then I can capture it by just tapping plus. As I move the picker and tap plus, colors are added. Now that I have a set of vintage colors, I'll tap Save to add them to my palette. I'm going to give this palette a name, Vintage. And tap Save. My Vintage custom palette is now ready to use. I can see by its larger size in the Hue color row, it is the active palette, and its colors are open and ready to select for painting. One final tip. It is easy to share favorite palettes with other devices that have this app. Because palettes are part of a paper, when you open More to share a paper from Paint, the transfer file, XFR data, will send along your paper and all its palettes. And that's the overview of painting and annotating graph papers. I hope you enjoy getting creative with your graph papers.